one of the craziest times that I ever got lost was at a parking garage. I was visiting a hospital down in Lexington, Kentucky, and it was a unique garage in that it looked like there were almost two different garages blended into one. And long story short, after visiting a family member there, I walked back to this garage, and I walked and I walked and I walked, and I cannot find my car anywhere. Last ditch desperation, I went back to the hospital where my dad was still there visiting a family member, and he took me to his car. We get in his car and we drive around and around and around until we finally find my car so I can go back home to Northern Kentucky. So, you know, I don't know if you've ever been lost like that before, but you sometimes just stop and say, how in the world did this happen? How did I get here? What got me to this point? And that's what I want to talk about when I talk about this great story of life that we're calling Three Circles. You know, we started with the first circle, which is God's design. And if you remember in talking about that last week, there's some great stuff there. God created everything. He created you and me. He created us with a purpose and with a design. He designed us, and we were made to walk with Him, and everything was awesome. I mean, in Genesis 3:8, we see in that one verse that God was walking in the garden and looking to hang out with Adam and Eve, and yet something bad happened because they ended up hiding from God in that moment. Well, that's what I want to talk to you about now, is the next thing that kind of entered in that sort of took everything from being awesome to not so awesome, is this little three-letter word that has been just messing with humanity since the beginning, and that is sin. And its very core, very simple definition of sin is simply disobedience to God. When you disobey God, that's a sin. That's probably the best way to define what it is. And you know what? We are tempted to sin. You know, in Genesis 3, we see that the serpent was the tempter of Adam and Eve, and boy, is he sneaky. You know, he said, wait, did God really say that? Kind of casting doubt on God. And at one point, he even flat out called God a liar and said, you're not going to die if you eat of the forbidden fruit. You won't die. And it was just a complete lie at that point. And so this is something to remember, that we are tempted to sin, but not only that, we are deceived into sinning. And sometimes it's the enemy deceiving us, and sometimes we're fooling ourselves and lying to ourselves about it, and maybe other people are lying to us about it. But at the bottom line, though, the thing you got to know about sin is that sin is something we do. Sin is something you do. Sin is something I do. We sin. We have a sin issue. And to explain the way things are in the world, sin came into the world there in Genesis 3, and man, it's been wreaking havoc ever since. And really, as you read the entire Bible, you don't finally see relief, 100% complete relief from sin happening until the end in Revelation 21 and Revelation 22. But God has been doing some stuff that we're going to talk about next week to actually the next 2 or 3 weeks to sort of help alleviate the problem. But the first thing we must do is admit this is a big deal. This is a big problem. And there's so many verses in the Bible that talk about just how big a deal sin is. I mean, Adam and Eve were cast out of the garden. They were banished. Death entered into the world. In Genesis 5, we even see that things got so bad that God decided to reboot humanity and starting over with just one faithful family, because everything humans were doing were so utterly wicked and sinful. And I just have to wonder, you know, have we gotten that much better than the days of Noah? I mean, we are so selfish. We want to do what we want to do, and we don't always think of the things of God, and we don't always put other people's needs above our own. I mean, there's so many things we can talk about when it comes to sin. In Psalm 51, which is a psalm that David wrote after one of his worst screw-ups ever, as he committed adultery with Bathsheba and covered it up with the arranged murder of one of his own soldiers who was the husband of Bathsheba. I mean, it's an incredibly horrible thing that David did, and he wrote this psalm, Psalm 51, which is my favorite psalm. But he said in one verse in that psalm that I was a sinner from the moment I was conceived, born a sinner. This is rooted in us. It's in our DNA, and you don't have to train a child to lie and be selfish. We see that sin is there. So what am I saying all this for? We can go over verse after verse, so many verses about we sin. Romans 3:23 says that every single person, 10 out of 10 people, sin. We are sinners. But this brings me to the next step that I hope everybody can just sort of take together. And sounds like such an elementary step, but the next step we must take is to admit that we are a sinner. I mean, even if you've been following Christ for a long time, even if you've been going to church a long time, I mean, I have conversation after conversation after conversation where we, over and over again with people that I know that we're sharing our stories and we're opening up, we still recognize that sin is crouching. It is right there. And if we're not careful, it will continue to drag us away. That's the thing I want you to just keep in mind. In the great cosmic story of life, God's design has escaped us because sin has literally dragged us away from it. Our choice, our choosing of sin pulls us away from God's design into something else that we'll talk about next week that we need to elaborate on. Well, we must understand this is the problem. Sin is the problem. And until we recognize that, we will just be saying, how did I get here? I'm not where I think I should be. I'm not necessarily where I want to be. How did this happen? What went wrong? Friends, I'm telling you that what went wrong for you and for me, for all of humanity, is sin. In the great cosmic story, it is what separated us from God. It's what's robbed us of us understanding what it means and feels like to walk with Him and live in His purpose. But it's more than just what's happened in the cosmic story of life. It's what's happened to you, and it's what's happened to me. We have a sin problem, and the first baby step we must take in order to deal with it is to admit it. I sin. I am a sinner. I hope that you can enjoy some great discussion as a group together. There's some really interesting questions in the small group guide that will get you talking about this idea of sin and maybe being able to share some stories like this is kind of personal, but how have you seen sin in your own life pull you away from God's design for your life? How have you seen it personally pull you away from walking with Him? You know, how do you know what a sin is? And why doesn't God just kind of give us a pass? I mean, why is this such a big deal? You know, I mean, honestly, a lot of times we as parents or we as adults, we'll let things slide by. Maybe we let things slide by as bosses or slide by as teachers, but apparently this sin thing is such a big deal. I mean, God just totally kicked Adam and Eve out of the garden, and there's a whole lot more that we will talk about later about what He did to His own Son, what He allowed to happen to His own Son because of this big deal thing called sin. How did we get here? What went wrong? The answer is sin.